that this Baroque cello looks a bit different to its modern counterpart. The most obvious difference is the lack of spike, and that affects how you sit with the instrument, of course, which I'll touch on a bit later. Less obviously is the way it's constructed. Generally speaking, it's a much lighter instrument than the modern cello, and this is because there is less tension across the whole instrument due to a lower bridge and the angle of the neck being less than the modern instrument. This means that the cello can be made of a lighter wood and has much less reinforcements on the inside of the instrument. You can see that the strings are also different, made of gut. The top two bare, the lower two wound in silver. And the fingerboard is much shorter than the modern cello. The last aspect is the bow. The shape, as you can see, is slightly less concave than the modern bow, and the weighting is very different. The heel end is very heavy and the tip end is very light, so that the difference in weight is more extreme than in the modern bow, which dictates to me how I use it. So to move on to how to play it, I won't give a lesson here and now, but I'll just give a few brief pointers. First of all, how to deal with lack of spike. It's not as difficult as it seems, and actually, when you go back to playing with a cello with a spike, it can seem almost restrictive. The cello is not rooted to the ground without a spike, and so I have more freedom. I feel more flexible, and this feels like it allows me to do more physically with the instrument, particularly in the bow. I sit with it between not so much my knees, but my legs, so it's not a grip, it's more of a sort of nuanced hold. There is balance and a slight tension, just to stop moving around too much. As we all know, too much flexibility can be a disadvantage. The cello is, other than that, I hold it very similarly to the modern instrument. It's slightly more upright due to the fact that I don't have the spike. So just to go into a brief amount of detail, you'll see from the shot that I have one foot under the cello and another one sort of balancing it on my calf, and my feet are not flat on the ground. So there's a little bit more movement allowed with this hold. Sometimes you've got to be careful if you're moving fast up and down the fingerboard, not to move your legs too much, as it all gets a bit rock and roll. The bow, in order to cope with the extreme weight difference between heel and tip, you hold it further away from the heel than you would in a modern bow. This also means, of course, that I can move it up and down if I need to, and if I want a heavier stroke, I'll move my hand just briefly down to the heel a bit further, a bit closer to the heel. And if I want a lighter stroke, maybe one that is going on for a relatively long time, I will move my hand further up the bow, and that will enable me to lift the bow more easily. The cello's main role, certainly at the very beginning of the 18th century, was as a continuo instrument. It was there to support the keyboard player or the plucked continuo player, or maybe both. And it supported them in terms of adding weight to the harmonic progression through the piece, and also being able to add a little bit more, perhaps more expression within single notes than either the plucked or keyboard instrument could at the time. Partly due to the fact that the cello only has one note to play, so I'm able to concentrate more on just that one note rather than more than one. As a cello continuo, I will also make sure that I am listening and often mirror both the solo part in their articulation and dynamics, but also the other continuo players as well. So I had a sort of dual role in keeping my ears open for everyone in the group, copying what they're doing in terms of expression and articulation and bowing if I was another string player. As the 18th century progressed, the cello became more popular as a solo instrument alongside the violin. Previous to that, although there was a certain amount of overlap over the century, previous to that, the viol family were the top dog when it came to solo repertoire. The emergence of solo repertoire for the cello really went very much hand in hand with the sophistication of instruments. Makers like Stradivarius and his contemporaries started to improve the instrument, make it stronger, enable it to project more, and also cellos became more standardized across countries and regions. Whereas before they could differ from town to town in size and in shape and all sorts of things. So as the cello was able to project more and also to play in higher positions because the innovative makers were making changes to things like the length of fingerboard, it meant that cellists could play higher up on the fingerboard, and so their range was increased as well. And as with the violin and a lot of the other instruments of the time, the cellos were able to project in larger spaces, and so solo repertoire became much more widespread. And interestingly enough, a lot of the early cello composers were cellists themselves, so they were doing a great deal to bring the cello out into the limelight. So this final question, now I play the instrument, what else do I need to know? It's a difficult one, it's a very wide-ranging question, but I will try and just very briefly concentrate on what I feel is, as a continuo player and as a solo cello, Baroque cello player, what is the most important. And for me, I think it's to be able to communicate the purpose of the music in the context of the time it was written as much as we can. So this means using knowledge of the preferred styles of the time and of the places, because it did change depending on what music you were playing, whether it was from France, Italy, Germany, or whatever. So this means taking into consideration articulation, which I've already mentioned, bowing, where I do down bows, where I do double up bows, where I do slurs, then that takes you into lengths of phrases and how you approach and come out of cadences. And there are lots of differences in all of these points to apply to the music you're playing. And then you have to decide how the piece itself dictates this, whether or not it's a solo allegro movement, whether it's an expressive saraband, whether it's an elegant minuet. So when you heard my rendition of Bach's minuet from his G major suite, hopefully you will have heard me emphasizing the first beat of mostly every second bar. If I had done every bar, it would have weighted the minuet down far too much. And while the minuet, this particular minuet, probably wouldn't have been danced to, it still has to have, you still have to be able to, in my book, you have to be able to imagine someone dancing to it, how they would look, how they would move. And so in the minuet, the down step, the one that's rooted to the ground, is always the first beat of the bar. The next two beats of the bar are when the dancer is up on their toes. So that was one of the things I was hoping to communicate. Other things like how I played notes falling with larger intervals between them, I would play them lighter. And you would have listened and heard sections, particularly in the second half of the minuet, where the phrases were longer. And this is dictated by the harmonic progression of the music and the ability to show the music leading to somewhere. And we call this the architecture of the piece, where there are ups and downs and directions to ends or middles of phrases, etc. And here, I hope you would have heard some legato playing, where I was playing notes that were very close to each other, and so they become more expressive.